According to Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, there were more than 8 lakh international students in Canada in 2022, out of which 40% students were from India, which is constituting the largest international student group in Canada. This is the kind of craziness among the students of India for Canada, which is also one of the most factor amongst other behind the settlement of Indians in Canada. From this perspective, it is crucial to know the relation between India and Canada that since when Indians have been started going crazy for Canada. For this, we need to understand the relation into different phases from past to present. For this, we need to deep dive into the history of both the countries, which will help us in better understanding the relation between India and Canada. But the history of relation of both the countries started from colonial era. And the question comes here is that from where the colonial era started, and the answer of this question here is that this had been started from the Europe, but now the other question comes here is that how this colonial power had started and what was the reason behind its starting under which the India and Canada's relations started. Otherwise, geographically the relation between India and Canada is totally impossible in that time from the perspective of geographic locations, because both the countries located in the opposite corner from one another of this planet, and the distance between both the countries are around more than 11,400 kilometers. If you think modern day European countries like United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Russia and other powers who started the practice of colonialism in the world, then you are absolutely wrong. Because the practice of colonialism was first started in ancient and medieval time. And this was practiced by the Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Turks, and Han Chinese and Arab powers. Their legacy of colonialism was followed by the later powers of Europeans, Americans, Ottomans, and Japanese powers between 1492 to 1991. The period of exploration and colonizations of Europe was fueled largely by necessity. Europeans had become accustomed to the goods from Asia. Silk, spices, and pottery goods were very fashionable and became necessity items in Europe that had for centuries traveled the Silk Road. This was the time of 15th century. This period is called the Renaissance in the history of Europe. The Renaissance was a cultural movement that profoundly affected European intellectual life in the early modern period. This was started in 14th century from Italian city named Florence. Then it spread rest of the Italy and later spreading rest of the Europe by 16th century. Probably every aspect of intellectual debate, art, architecture, philosophy, literature, music, science, technology, politics, religion, or other aspects of intellectual inquiry were influenced by this movement. The Renaissance intellectual basis was found in its version of humanism, and the power of church declined, and this shifted the focus from religious authority to humanism and secularism. As a result, the influence of the church diminished. At that time, the church controlled most educational institutions in Europe. Monasteries, cathedral schools, and universities was largely run by clergies, and the church promoted a worldview rooted in Christian theology. One side, the intellectual people were challenging the authority of church by their innovation and their creativity as well. And at the same time, this innovation and creativity were sowing the seed of exploration of world, later on which led the path of colonizations. The famous innovation of that period, which led the exploration of world, was shipbuilding and its development that could sail against the wind and giving it a greater flexibility in long distance exploration. The another innovation was the magnet compass, a navigation tools that could give more confidence to sailors in navigating the uncharted water and contributed directly to the era of global exploration and colonization. Innovations of the astrolabe, an instrument that could help the sailor in determining their latitude. Printing press was another milestone innovation of this period. Printed maps, books, and treatises about the New Worlds, as well reports from explorers like Marco Polo and Amerigo Vespucci that fueled European interest in overseas exploration and colonization. The improvement in cartography has seen significant advancement in map making and the creation of more accurate world maps and globes that helped explorers navigate across the oceans and identify new territories to conquer. The development and refinements of firearms and gunpowder during the period also played a major major roles in the success of European colonization. The shipbuilding technology allowed for larger, more durable ships that could travel across the oceans carrying goods, soldiers, and settlers. This also provided European powers a means to transport treasures, slaves, and settlers to the New World and other colonial territories. Beside all these innovations, the European countries recognized the potential profits of securing better trade with Asia and sought new routes by sea. The quest of gold and glory were another factors of motivation which led the European power to explore the Americas continents, and the spread of Christianity were also the motivated factors which influenced European power. This combination of economic, political, religious, and technological factors where the European monarchs were motivated by the desire to expand their kingdoms, assert power, and compete with rival nations like Spain, Portugal, and later England, France, and the Netherlands. Just because of this period is also called the Age of Exploration, also known as the Age of Discovery, during which the European powers expanded their horizon of exploring, mapping, and establishing trade routes and colonies across the world. But at the same time, the dispute arose among the European rival nations, and to resolve the disputes over newly discovered lands during the Age of Exploration, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed between Portugal and Spain on June 1494 with the mediation of Pope. This treaty established an imaginary line known as a line of demarcation running from north to south about 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Spain was granted the rights to explore the colonized lands to the west of the line, primarily the Americas, and Portugal was given the rights to land to the east, including parts of Africa and Asia. Now the time has come to talk about the Canada under French and Britishers. Before Britishers, French were already established their colonies in Canada. After French, British also explored the north part of Canada in order to establish their colony in Canada. But both the European powers started war in order to control and dominate the Canada and incorporating in its colony. The war started, which is known as the famous 7-Year War, also known as the French and North Indian War of North America, and this war was ended with the Treaty of Paris of 1763. And under this treaty, France ceded most of the Canada's territory to the Great Britain, and this treaty marked the end of French colonial power in North America, leaving Britain as dominant European power on the continent. During this period, French and British have also other colonies around the world, and the war between France and British in any part of the world, it had made direct impact on the other colonies that are on the other parts of the world. At the same time, France and British were also competing to control the Indian territories in order to establish their dominance and control it. And at the end, the French also lost in India and British got succeeded and started dominating the Indian territories one by one so that it could gain control on the other British colonies all around the world. With ending the 7 Years War between France and British, Britishers got the supreme authority in both the continent, that is Asia and America. As India and Canada were the part of the British colonies, and so that the impact of British policies were directly impacting on one another colonies. One side, the Canadians were exploited and oppressed by the Britishers' policies, and the other side, Indians were facing the same challenges. Britishers used to transport workers, farmers from one colonies to other because they were very cheap and cost effective than the British labor worker. Starting in the late 19th and early 20th century, many Indian immigrants, particularly from Punjab region, settled in Canada. The Indian community in Canada became a vocal advocate for India's independence, often speaking out against British colonial rule. Leaders within the community such as Lala Lajpat Rai used the platform to campaign for Indian self-rule, gather support and raise awareness about India's plight under British colonialism. The Indian diaspora, particularly in cities like Vancouver, became actively involved in fundraising for Indian nationalist movements, organizing protests and writing letters to both Canadian and British authorities. This advocacy helped spreading awareness about the Indian independence across North America. Many revolutionary leaders like Bhavani Dayal, Kartar Singh Sarawa and others who were involved in revolutionary activities against the British sought refuge in Canada to escape British repression. These leaders continued to spread their messages and raise support for the Indian cause while in Canada. Now the question comes here is that how India and Canada relation get started. As we already talked about that in the early 19th century, India and Canada were part of the British Empire. The Indo-Canadian community was formed in the late 19th century due to the Indian immigration to Canada, and majority of whom were Punjabis, which included veterans of the British Indian Army. When the British Crown took over India, Queen Victoria proclaimed that Indians would enjoy equal privilege across the British Empire without discrimination. The Indian immigrants settled mostly in the sparsely populated Western Canada and took up the jobs such as law enforcement officers and lumberjacks. However, the race relation with white Canadians were restrained as the socio-economic system ensured racial discriminations and minimal direct contact by setting up various barriers. Though initially reluctant to go to these countries due to the racial discrimination, many young men chose to go upon the assurance that they would not meet the same fate in the early 20th century. The Canada government quotas was established to cap the number of Indians allowed to immigrate to Canada in the early 20th century and allowed fewer than 100 people from India a year until 1957, when it was marginally increased to 300 people per year. As both the countries were part of the British Empire, and because of this, they became the member nation of the Commonwealth of Nations, so that all the past British colony could strengthen their relations to one another. This is what exactly happened between India and Canada, and after the Indian independence in 1947, the relation between both the countries would strengthen. The strengthened relation with Canada became one of the main reasons behind the bridge between India and the Western world. And in 1951, Canada started providing the foreign aid to India, which grew substantially under the Colombo Plan. The relationship between both the countries became more prominent by the personal relationship between the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and the Canadian Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent and Lester Pearson. Nehru addressed a joint session of the Canadian Parliament on 24 October 1949, and Canada supported Kunda hydroelectric projects, kind projects and aero surveys in Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh. During Cold War, though Canada was favorable towards the United States, but Canada maintained independent relations with India while the USA was providing aid to Pakistan. Now the next question comes here is that how the differences started growing between India and Canada. When India got independence from British rule, there were issues or tensions were arising among many countries like India, and many other countries were fighting for their sovereign rights from colonial powers, which influenced in establishing the relation between India and Canada, whether their relation continue to be further or not. But during this era, the famous Korean War, which is an armed conflict between the North Korea and the South Korea in the Korean Peninsula and their allies. North Korea was supported by China and Soviet Union, and the South Korea was supported by United States. At the same time, there was a Suez crisis, which is also known as the Second Arab-Israeli War, and which is also known as a Sinai War in Israel, that was a British-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt in 1956. The primary objective of this war was reopening the Strait of Tiran and the Gulf of Aqaba, as the recent tightening of the 8-year-long Egyptian blockade further prevented Israeli passage. At the end, Egypt's Sinai Peninsula enabled it to attain freedom of navigation through the Straits of Tiran, but the Suez Canal was closed from October 1956 to March 1957. But during this issue, the United States President Dwight D. Eisenhower had issued a strong warning to the British. If they were to invade Egypt, he threatened serious damage to British financial systems by selling the American government's bonds of pound sterling. And the other major events were Soviet intervention in Hungary. These events were not directly connected with India-Canada relations, but these were somewhere shaping the worldviews. Because of this, India and Canada's position does matter on these events. At the same time, Kashmir was also a burning issue between India and Pakistan, because on the day of partition, Kashmir decided not to be the part of India and Pakistan as well. Soon Kashmir became the part of India because of Pakistanis' illegal infiltrating activities in Kashmir. So Canada's position also matters here for India. From this perspective, India-Canada relation does matter here. Now the year 1962 came. There was something unexpected happened this year, that India came to conflict with China, the infamous Indo-China War of 1962. This was a sudden war where India was ill-prepared and under-equipped. Despite India's effort to defend its territory. China's superior military tactics and preparation led to a swift victory. The war resulted in a deepening of tensions between India and China. On the other side, Pakistan was continuously infiltrating in Kashmir region since the time of partition, and India engaged in this kind of proxy war with Pakistan in Kashmir. And in the year 1965, India engaged in a full-scale war with Pakistan. And the tensions from both the sides, China in the north and Pakistan in the west, where India realized to test the nuclear weapon in order to counterbalance both the country, China and Pakistan, both together. Because in 1964, China had already tested the nuclear weapon. With this, India went under pressure to prevent its sovereignty to fight a tactical war where nuclear test is must to become a sovereign nuclear power to influence the international strategic autonomy. This was also the time of Cold War, where the nuclear power states like USA and Soviet Union fighting for their dominance, and Pakistan was the strong ally of United States of America in Asia. And the United States of America support to Pakistan by economically, politically and militarily put pressure on India to go nuclear test. The 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, where India was directly involved in this, and Pakistan was fully supported by two nuclear power states, China and United States of America, that made immense pressure on India to take an extraordinary step in order to prevent its sovereign power in the world arena. And finally, in 1974, in the name of Smiling Buddha, India surprised the world by doing nuclear tests under the leadership of Indira Gandhi. The world considered it a clear violation of Non-Proliferation Treaty and the CANAD as well. Basically, in the midst of the Cold War, the United States of America and Russia have built massive nuclear arsenals, and the other nations like United Kingdom, France and China also developed nuclear weapons. This led to an increasingly dangerous global environment where the possibility of nuclear conflict or accidental launches was seen as a serious threat. For this, the NPT was created as a way to prevent more countries from acquiring nuclear weapons, which would have further exacerbated tensions and instability. Because by the late 1950s and the 1960s, several countries including India, Israel and Pakistan were suspected or interested in developing nuclear powers, and the spread of these weapons would have made global security even more precarious. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was opened for signature on 1st July 1968 and entered into force on 5th March 1970. It was designed in order to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy. But from the perspective of India, it is important to know that India has not signed this treaty because India considered it as a discriminatory. Because this treaty established a division between nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. The treaty essentially recognized only these 5 countries as legitimate nuclear powers, while obligating other countries to forego development of nuclear weapons. India viewed nuclear weapons as a legitimate means of national security and self-defense, particularly given its regional security concerns. India was concerned that the NPT would limit its ability to develop nuclear weapons, even though it faced strategic threats from its neighbors, especially China, which has already tested nuclear weapons by the time NPT was signed. The nuclear test significantly altered the diplomatic relationship between the two countries. Canada is strongly opposed to the India's nuclear test, primarily due to concern about nuclear non-proliferation and the potential misuse of nuclear technology. This test really surprised Canada, as Canada, which had been a key supplier of nuclear technology to India, especially for nuclear peaceful purpose, and Canada thought the India is misusing it and using it in developing nuclear weapons. Canada had helped India build its first nuclear reactor, the Cyrus reactor, which was originally intended for peaceful purpose, but after this test, Canada immediately suspended the export of nuclear materials and technology to India. This was a direct response to India's use of civilian nuclear technology for military purposes, violating the understanding under which Canada had provided these materials. This had led to a halt in future cooperation. Canada condemned India's nuclear tests at various international platforms and publicly expressed its disappointment. Canada also imposed a series of economic measures, including restrictions on the export of sensitive technologies that could potentially be diverted to military applications. And for some periods of time, the relation between both the countries were cooled. After this non-proliferation treaty, the issue of Sikh riots comes after this. As in 1980s, the Sikh community in India had been experiencing mounting tensions with the government. Especially during the 1980s, a Sikh political party named Akali Dal was demanding for greater autonomy, and that led the rise of militant groups like the Khalistani movement, which sought an independent state. That was a major flashpoint. In 1984, the pro-Khalistani militant overpowered the Golden Temple and stored arms and ammunition inside the Golden Temple. And to remove these militants from the temple, a Blue Star, a military operation was launched, but the operation caused significant damage and led to civilian casualties, deepening resentment within the Sikh community, as Golden Temple is the holiest site in the Sikhism. At last, on 31st October 1984, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards in retaliation for her decision to launch Operation Blue Star. In the immediate aftermath of Indira Gandhi's assassination, violent mobs, often with the least involvement of political figures and police, targeted Sikhs. They attacked Sikh homes, businesses and Gurudwara. Reports indicate that mobs used weapons, torches and other means of murders, loot and burn down the properties of Sikhs with little intervention from the police. Survivors of the violence describe horrific incidents including killing, rapes and forced displacement. As Canada is home to one of the largest Sikh diaspora in the world, but with this, the Canadian Sikh community deeply affected by these riots, which were leading to widespread activism and advocacy. Many organizations within the Sikh community as well as the broader public, the Canadian Sikh community is potentially active and influential, and it played a key role in bringing attention to the anti-Sikh riots and called for the Canadian governments to take a stronger stance and pressurize the Indian government to conduct fair investigations and prosecute those who were responsible for the violence. The anti-Sikh riots and the perception of inadequate justice in India was a significant issue in Canada, especially among the Sikh population. These events shaped Canada's foreign policy and its approach to human rights issues in South Asia. Canadian politicians, especially those representing ridings with large Sikh population, voiced their concern and maintained pressure on the Indian government to ensure accountability. The events of 1984 and the subsequent treatment of Sikh played a significant role in strengthening support for the Khalistani movement, which called for an independent Sikh state. And this movement had supporters in various countries including Canada, where there was a complex interplay between advocacy for human rights and concerns about political violence. The riots had an impact on the relationship between India and Canada. While Canada has maintained a diplomatic relationship with India, the events of 1984 and the perceived lack of accountability in India created a period of tensions. In order to seek the revenge of Blue Star operation, on 23 June 1985, the members of Babar Khalsa, which is a Sikh extremist group, carried out a bomb blast in Air India Flight 182. The route of this flight was from Montreal to London and with a final destination of New Delhi. The bomb was planted in a suitcase in the cargo hold of the aircraft. It detonated mid-air at approximately 31,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean near Ireland, and the explosion caused the plane to break apart, and the wreckage was scattered over a wide area of the ocean, and all 329 people on board were killed, in which 268 were Canadians, 27 were Britons, and 24 were Indians along with other nationalities. The bombing of Air India Flight 182 is the deadliest terrorist attack in the Canadian history, the deadliest aviation incident in the history of Air India, and was the world's deadliest act of aviation terrorism until the September 11, 2001 attacks, which is infamous 9/11 attacks. The mastermind behind the bombing was believed to be Inderjeet Singh Rayat, who was a dual British-Canadian national who was pleaded guilty in 2003, and Talvinder Singh Parmar, who was a Canadian Sikh separatist leader and who was one of the key individuals associated with the militant group Babar Khalsa. As Babar Khalsa is a Sikh extremist organization that was founded in the 1970s, it is most well known for its involvement in acts of violence and terrorism, particularly in relation to the push for an independent Sikh state called Khalistan. These Sikh extremists were disillusioned with the Indian government's treatment of the Sikh community and were inspired by the goal of creating an independent independent Sikh homeland called Khalistan. The group is rooted in the belief that Sikhs should have their own sovereign state, free from what they perceived as marginalization and persecution of the Sikh population by the Indian governments. This ideology became particularly pronounced following events such as Operation Blue Star in 1984, when the Indian military raided Golden Temple to remove armed militants led by Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, a prominent Sikh separatist leader. But the catch here is that the Indian government has taken significant steps to counter the activities of our Khalsa. In order to do this, the government emphasized a major military and intelligence focus in Punjab, where the group's influence and most pronounced. Policies such as Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, which is known as TADA, were implemented to deal with extremist activities. Indian government designated Babar Khalsa as a terrorist organization. Regarding the Air India Flight 182 bomb blast, the Indian government was unhappy with Canada because it was believed that Canadian authorities were aware of the potential threat posed by the Sikh extremist group, particularly those based in Canada. The Canadian government was seen as being slow to act against these groups despite intelligence reports and warnings suggest the possibility of violent acts. There were allegations that Canadian intelligence agency did not adequately share information with their Indian counterparts who were concerned about rising extremist activities by Sikh militants. The Indian government believed that the better cooperation and intelligence sharing between the two countries could have prevented the bomb blast. The Indian governments felt that the Canadian authorities did not pursue a strong enough response to these individuals, leading to frustration over delays and perceived leniency. The trial that followed in Canada ended with mixed results, and the main accused, including the masterminds, were not all brought to justice. This resulted in the strained diplomatic relation between India and Canada. And now, the year 1998 comes, where India once again, in the name of Operation Shakti India, conducted nuclear tests. This marked a significant escalations in nuclear capabilities and shifted the regional balance of power, especially in South Asia. The Canadian government at that time issued a formal statement condemning India's nuclear tests, and Canada expressed serious concern about the implication of these tests for regional stability and international peace. As Canada had been a strong advocate of non-proliferation and disarmament, Canada, along with other members of the international community, imposed economic and diplomatic sanctions on India. And these sanctions targeted areas such as defense and military technologies aimed at limiting the spread of nuclear and missile technologies. In 2015, in Canada, the Liberal Party won the federal election and Justin Trudeau became the Prime Minister of Canada. At the same time, the Sikh diaspora of Canada is the significant supporter of Justin Trudeau. Many Sikh politicians like Harjit Sajjan, Navdeep Vance, Amarjit Sohi were part of Trudeau's cabinet and many became Member of Parliament in Canada. The prominence of Sikh representation in his government has reinforced a sense of belonging and representation within the community. Trudeau's government has acknowledged and supported significant Sikh issues such as the recognition of the 1984 anti-Sikh riots in India as a tragedy and his attendance at major Sikh events like annual Vaisakhi celebrations. Many Sikhs appreciate Trudeau's stance on human rights both domestically and internationally, which aligns with their values and historical experiences. As Canada has a significant Sikh population, particularly in the province of British Columbia and parts of Ontario, the political influence of these communities is notable, and politicians including Justin Trudeau have often sought support from Sikh Canadian groups to bolster their electoral prospects. And some of the Sikh organizations in Canada have been accused of having pro-Khalistani leanings, and groups like World Sikh Organizations and others have been vocal in supporting Sikh rights and issues related to Punjab. While some of these organizations focus on promoting Sikh culture and addressing issues like religious freedoms, others have been associated with more extreme forms of activism that support the idea of an independent Khalistan. And Trudeau has been known to engage with Sikh leaders and attend events organized by Sikh communities. This engagement has sometimes included with leaders and groups that have been linked to pro-Khalistani sentiments, leading to concerns and criticisms in both Canada and India. In 2018, it has been seen that the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, has been attending and speaking in a Sikh gathering which was organized by Sikh groups that has been accused of having pro-Khalistani sentiments, and one of the members of that group was the member of Canadian Parliament. The Indian government has expressed strong concerns over what it perceives as Canadian tolerance for pro-Khalistani movement. In particular, it has pointed out events and individuals linked to the movements who have operated within Canada, including those advocating for a referendum on Khalistan. The relationship between Canada and India has been strained at times due to these tensions. Now the year 2020 and 2021 comes where in the late 2020 and 2021, India experienced large-scale farmers' protests against new agricultural laws that were passed by the Indian government. Farmers, mainly from Punjab and Haryana, argued that these laws would favor large corporations over small farmers and potentially undermine the minimum support price system that ensures stable income for farmers. But a significant portion of Canada's population consists of people of Indian origin, including many from Punjab, where the farmers' protests were more intense. As a result of this, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, and some other politicians expressed support for farmers' right to peaceful protests and raised concern about the Indian government's handling of the situation. But the comments and the statement from the side of the Canadian officials and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, India viewed in its internal matters. But the comments and the statement from the side of the Canadian officials and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, India viewed it as an interference in its internal matters. India viewed Canada's stance as a breach of its sovereignty and a political move that could influence domestic sentiments. This led to a diplomatic strain between the two countries. The Indian governments emphasized that the agricultural laws were an internal matters and criticized foreign support for the protests as inappropriate. This farmer issue has affected India-Canada relations in terms of trade, diplomatic meetings and negotiations. Now the another twist comes in the relation between both the countries, and now the twist is Hardeep Singh Nijjar case, which is connected to the ongoing tensions between India and Canada, particularly involving issues related to Sikh activism. Basically, Hardeep Singh Nijjar was an influential figure in the Sikh community in British Columbia, Canada. He was active in promoting Sikh religious and cultural practices and involved in various community organizations. He was also a leader of the Sikh for Justice organization, which advocates for an independent Sikh states and has been declared a banned organization by the Indian government for its pro-Khalistani activities. Hardeep Singh Nijjar was labeled as a terrorist by Indian authorities for illegally plotting and promoting violence related to Khalistan cause. In June 2023, Hardeep Singh Nijjar was shot and killed outside the Gurudwara, the Guru Nanak Gurudwara in Surrey, British Columbia, and the killings of Hardeep Singh Nijjar was targeted and highly publicized, which led a significant concern in both India and Canada. India has accused elements within Canada of being complicit in or supportive of groups and individuals advocating for Khalistani movement, which the Indian government views as a security threat. The Indian government also alleged that the Canadian government has not done enough to counteract the activities of these pro-Khalistani organizations and individuals, including Nijjar. But the Canada had done something different here. The Canadian authorities, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, have expressed concern over the killings and stated that the investigation is ongoing, and the Nijjar case has heightened tension between Canada and India. When the Prime Minister publicly stated that the Canadian intelligence has been looking into credible allegations of Indian government's involvement in the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, though no conclusive evidence has been presented. But the Indian government has denied any involvement in Nijjar's killing and has criticized Canada's handling of the situations. India emphasized that it was a domestic issue and that Canada has not adequately cooperated with India on investigating the backgrounds of groups promoting violence. India also accused Canada of harboring individuals and organizations that promote separatism and terrorism, which it views as a threat of its sovereignty and security. After the allegation emerged, India and Canada have engaged in a war of words and have taken measures that signal strained bilateral ties. And allegations of India's involvement in the killings of Khalistani terrorist Hardeep Singh Nijjar, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin, faces severe challenges in India. In Canada, India has consistently criticized Canada for allowing anti-India activities by pro-Khalistani groups, which India views as a threat to its sovereignty, and Canada in turn expressed concern about India's alleged extraterritorial actions on Canadian soils, which they argued violated international norms. In the result of this, in October 2024, Canada expelled 6 Indian diplomats, including high commissioners, citing alleged involvement in serious criminal activities on Canadian soil. And in the response, India retaliated by expelling 6 Canadian diplomats, including the acting High Commissioner, of interfering in its internal matters.